I'd love you to stick around, and don't know if I'm in shot here, um, to have tea or coffee afterwards and get to know us a little bit better. If you've come and you want to give money, then there's a little money box just behind Paul and Dave, so you can stick some stuff in there if you'd like to. We're going to be thinking about Advent and hope today, and Isaiah 9 talks about, this is a famous verse, it says, "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light." So maybe you've got a Bible with you and you'll look that up. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. And I used to think Advent was about pretending each year that Christmas hadn't happened yet. And we kind of had to put ourselves in this imaginary zone where we pretend that Christmas, oh no, it hasn't happened. Or what would it be like if Christmas hadn't happened? And you kind of have to think like that for a month. But that's a bit of a strange thing to kind of trick ourselves into thinking each year. I mean, for those of you who are married, I mean, what would that look like if you did that a month before your anniversary every year? Just trick yourself into thinking you weren't married. It would be a bit odd. Don't do that. Or maybe we think of Advent and we just think of, building up to Christmas, and we think of going into the supermarket and hearing Wizard or Blizzard or whatever it is in the same old songs, or, favorite cup of eggnog or chai gingerbread latte for those of you who love that kind of thing. And I think when we think about Advent, it isn't supposed to be particularly romantic. It isn't necessarily about just getting all the Christmas feels. Advent is actually supposed to be a bit more apocalyptic. Apocalyptic as in, the end of the world. Not just the end of the world, but the end of one world and the beginning and the relaunching of another. Advent isn't just like the stag do to the wedding of Christmas or the hen do. It's actually more of a somber reminder that without God stepping in, we would be completely lost. We would be completely stuffed. And the idea is that we are prompted to place our hope again in God, in no one else but God, and not in the futile things that we often, get lulled into placing our hope into, the futile things that cannot deliver us from the present darkness that surrounds us, whether that's circumstances, whether that's things, whether that's, Mary mentioned, amazing. And I'm hoping my talk basically complements some of the stuff that you've said. It's really helpful. But we don't pretend that Christmas hasn't happened, okay? It has. It was remarkable. Jesus came and everything changed forever. But Advent is about recognizing that the world that we live in is still affected by evil and permeated by evil that destroys and desecrates. Just consider, just for a second, the astonishing levels of poverty that still exist in Edinburgh. Those of us who work, whether it's with young people or in different environments and sectors, this is your everyday experience. This is what you see. You can't trick yourself into just thinking on a Sunday morning that everything's okay. Poverty levels in Scotland. Consider what's going on in the world at the moment. I mean, I'm sure so many of our hearts were broken again, not for the first time, but again, as we heard the news of those who tried to cross over the English Channel this week. Absolutely devastating. And for that story, the same thing happening all around the world as refugees, as people who are fleeing from conflict, crises and situations and war, run into all sorts of horrible, disastrous situations. And they're the ones who escape, people who are trapped in situations that just they don't want to be in, that they never thought they would be in. Consider all the people trafficked around our world for profit. Consider the plight of the Uyghur people locked in so-called re-education camps in China. Consider the world. I've just given a few very easy examples. But what comes into your mind when you think of the evil that is still prevalent in our world? Can any of us really say that we're happy and content with the state that the world is in. Our world is deeply, deeply broken. And Advent is about reminding ourselves that that is the context that Jesus arrives. You know, we don't like to talk about it, do we? You know, when I talk to people about church, we like to talk about the good things that we're doing in the community, and the church being this kind of nice place, this positive place, even a place of refuge. And of course that's completely true, and we love all of that stuff. But it's easy to bypass the fact that we do need refuge from some of the horrible things that are going on, some of the places of hurt and destruction in our lives. And we don't often talk about, hey, yeah, I'm part of a local church. Really what we do is we kind of face up to evil, you know, week in, week out, and we contend with it, and we recognize it, because that might seem a bit weird to people, but I hope that is what we're actually doing. You know, that to confess Christianity is to confess that God chose to confront evil through his Son. The evil still permeates our world, but we will choose to hope that this is not the ultimate reality, and this is not either or even the end. This is not the end. What we can see, what is around us, is not everything. Advent is not the pre-drinks to the Christmas night out. Instead, Advent chooses to acknowledge the state of the world and not just rush on. You know, Christians are very good at saying, oh yeah, well, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming, isn't it? And that's good. A bit of Easter optimism is essential to our faith. But unless we actually learn also to sit in the reality of evil and brokenness and sin, we choose to limit the actual accomplishment of what God has done through the cross and the resurrection. I'm going to read a longer quote from an American preacher called Fleming Rutledge. She says, "In the church, this is the season of Advent. It's superficially understood as a time to get ready for Christmas. But in truth, it's the season for contemplating the judgment of God. Advent is the season that, when properly understood, doesn't flinch from the darkness that stalks us all in this world. Advent begins in the dark and moves towards the light." And that's why I'm hoping that we're going to enjoy this little journey through Advent. But knowing me, we'll have forgotten to do week 2 and week 3. I'll have come up with a different idea by next Friday. No, we won't. We will stick to the program. Advent begins in the dark and moves towards the light, but the season should not move too quickly or too glibly, lest we fail to acknowledge the depth of the darkness. So maybe you woke up feeling very Christmassy this morning as you saw the snow outside. First time ever seeing snow this morning for Markham, so that's very special. And then you turned up at church and the preacher was talking about this present darkness and evil in the world. But Advent doesn't necessarily buy selection boxes in July. Advent is about waiting before we move. Advent sits in prayer. And Advent forges hope through wrestling with the why of suffering, the why of the brokenness of our world. You know, we need saving. We are in desperate need of new management from the powers and the principalities that actually run a lot of this place. And the light that comes only makes sense in the context of the darkness. And so Isaiah chapter 9 we started from, prophesies something from deepest, darkest exile. They've been removed from where they are in Israel. And in exile you have no choice. You know, you don't have to sit and, like we are doing, kind of imagine some of the bad things in the world. You're there. You know, you're a long way from home. You don't have an identity, you don't have a purpose in exile. You just have to sit and wait for something to happen and hope. And so he says, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. Advent doesn't paper over any cracks. It doesn't shirk back from reality. In fact, it faces up to evil. It stares it down. And it reminds us of what we prefer to stick our heads in the sand about. Advent says, yes, the world is very dark, and change might happen, but only if God steps in. Only if God breaks through. I'll read a little bit more from Isaiah chapter 9. Should be up just behind me. But there's no way you're going to be able to read that. That's my bad. For all the boots of the tramping soldiers and all the uniforms stained in blood shall be burned as fuel for fire. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. The government shall be upon his shoulders, and he is named Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His government shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom. He will establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time onward and forevermore. A Prince of Peace will step in and will establish a new order, a new government, a government that's characterized by ever-increasing peace. So in God's kingdom, weapons of war will be transformed into instruments of farming. And at last, the nations will find their way out of the darkness of endless war into the light of God's enduring peace. That's the cosmic big picture that we find ourselves in this morning. And this is Isaiah's great hope, that Christians take Isaiah's hope and make a daring claim that Jesus is that Prince of Peace. They didn't know it at the time, but we have seen and we have heard. Jesus is the one who makes Isaiah's dreams come true from the day of Pentecost, from the early days of the church to the present. This is what Christians have placed their hope in. And I often meet up with people, probably more before COVID than recently, and just to find out how things are going. Maybe I've known them for a long time, and they always say at the end of the chat, at the end of the coffee or whatever, listen, we love what's happening in Stenhouse. We love what you're up to. If there's anything we can do at all, anything, just let us know. And I have a lot of lovely friends, and they really do mean it in that moment. They mean it. They just want to help. And I am just very happily, very awkward, and just say, well, if you ever want to move to Stenhouse, that would be great. Just come and get involved. Come and join our church. Come and make new friends in West Edinburgh. And I don't think any of you are shocked to hear that I do say that out loud. And they're like, oh, right, well, I kind of meant, I'm not really sure what I meant. It's just really something you say, isn't it? But getting stuck in somewhere, whether it's just even in our street where we live, or really invested in the place that we work beyond just doing the hours that we are paid to do, whatever it is, can be a big ask. We all want to be consultants, don't we? We all love to have people come to us and just say, oh, well, this is probably what you should do. It's easier dishing out advice and keeping a certain distance than it is with, the chair stacking, relationship building, vulnerability of things not working out, facing rejection, life of actually being involved in the life of a community. But God had kind of explored the consultancy method a bit. He spoke through the prophets, and they were ignored and often killed. And even then, God's desire was to display to his people the full extent of his love and his character. And so here's some of the good news this morning. Good news is that God is not a distant consultant. God is not an unconcerned CEO. God is not this chess player in space kind of moving all the pieces around while the clock just ticks. God is not a self-interested politician sort of swindling more money than they are owed. John 1 says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So God, more good news this morning. God threw himself into the pain and the uncertainty and the volatility of the world that God created. And if you want some homework for Advent, aside from just eating as many mince pies as possible, open the first page of Matthew's Gospel and discover the stories of the names that are listed in the genealogy, because it's packed full of scandal, it's packed full of sinfulness. It's this family tree that Jesus was born into. And I mean it, do go and explore it. It will take more than just a quick glance. And you'll think, oh, I've never heard of them before. And you can go and look them up and read their story in Genesis or somewhere else. But Jesus wasn't just simply beamed down from outer space, but born into this very human and broken lineage, because God is with us. And there are people who used to say, just as church was kind of starting 2,000 years ago, that Jesus just appeared to be human, that he wasn't really human. Maybe just for a bit, but he was just a spirit who masqueraded as flesh for a while, but not my Jesus. He really fully entered in to the brokenness of humanity. My King stepped into the expectations and the hopes and the fears of everyone and took on flesh and took on humanity and began this beautiful redemption of our humanity through God's Spirit. You know, a light has dawned. A rebirth has taken place. And I met somebody in the prison a couple of years ago, and he was from Bethlehem. He was born in Palestine, and it was just around Christmas time, I think, and it really sort of stuck with me. Things hadn't worked out well for his life. Things weren't straightforward, and he asked me to pray for him, and I said that I would. You know, Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, 2,000 years later, it shows you that just because Jesus came doesn't mean that everything is okay. We still have to sit and wait and recognize where we are and hold one in one hand and hold the other, because the King has come and the kingdom is still coming, and the King is coming again. So this Advent, there's an invitation to wait, to be still in the middle of it. Just a quick aside, you won't do that unless you have a bit of a plan. It doesn't happen just by accident. To actually sit in God's presence, or to read through one of the Gospels and read through the Christmas story, or read through Isaiah and understand what it meant to be in exile and understand what it meant to wait. You know, when we do these things, my prayer for all of us in this church is that hope will begin to rise again. Because the Christian faith has very little to offer when our hope disappears, when our hope gets lost. You know, yes, we still walk in darkness, but, and particularly, as I said before, when we're involved in the lives of real people and real situations, real relationships, we will witness hard things. We will probably, some of us even this week, are just processing traumatic things that we've maybe seen at work or in our neighborhoods. Things that should really make us completely despair, except for the fact that we are the people of the light. So we read a bit from John chapter 1, but this is from 1 John in the shorter letter later on in the New Testament. He says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched. This we proclaim concerning the word of life." And the word of life is Jesus himself. And why I picked out that little verse, and I don't have too much longer to go, why I picked out that little verse was, in Christianity, we're not just dealing with positive thinking. We're not just thinking, oh, well, it'll be all right. I'm sure they'll be better soon. Don't worry about it too much. But actually, what we're doing is we are testifying to what we have witnessed in history and what's been passed down to us in history, and we are testifying to what we've experienced in our hearts. What we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at with our hands and have touched. This is what we proclaim. So the transforming power of God to change lives around, the word of life, Jesus. We don't deal with positive thinking. We don't deal with wishful thinking either. Just as Paul prayed, we prayed for each other. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust him, so that this hope overflows out of you. That's a beautiful prayer that Paul prayed for the church in Romans. May the God of hope fill you with joy and peace as you trust him, so that this hope overflows out of you. You know, if you're doing a little audit of your life, maybe over the last few months or last few years, and I'm not saying this to make anybody feel bad about themselves, but would we say that hope is overflowing from our lives, or are we beginning to get a bit crushed with the weight of disappointment? Are we beginning to be a bit sort of so caught up with what's happening around us that actually we sometimes forget the hope that we were called to come and see and witness and touch and see and hear? It's easy for our hope to get swallowed up in despair. It's easy for the light to become just a tiny flicker and become enveloped in the trappings of life. But our first calling is to keep watch. So one little image for you to think about when you think of Advent. Hopefully this sticks with you. And I'm glad that the candle, I just said the word flicker and didn't want to look left and see the candle's gone out. It hasn't. But Psalm 130 says, I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits, and in his word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning. We read that one together. Try that. I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits, and in his word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning. So Psalm 130 isn't about Advent. In fact, there's nothing about Advent in the Bible. But Psalm 130 gives us a taste of what Advent could be all about. Watching, waiting, looking for hope, and finding it in the Word of God, in Scripture, but ultimately finding it in the Word of life, who is Jesus. You know, have we lost hope somewhere along the way? Has it been eked out of us somewhere? Has church become about programs and about saying the right things instead of actually announcing to the world around us that this darkness has been pierced, and it's been pierced by Jesus? And then we can pray. Sunday's coming, of course it is. Christmas is coming, of course it is. But our character is often formed in the days where we learn to wait. Our hope is often forged in the middle of the night, where we don't fall asleep on the job, but we stay attentive to the chink of light in the distance. The people walking in the darkness have seen a great light. And on those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. I think something was happening, but I missed it. We pray, and I just particularly, there's been a lot of words in there, a lot of different scriptures, but I particularly just want to pray for those who actually, when we hear this word hope, it actually is beginning to sound a bit unfamiliar, because maybe we used to think, oh yeah, I'm somebody that lives with hope. Each day I place my hope in Jesus each morning, but it doesn't feel like that at the moment. And if that